Hi, Jane.
Welcome. Welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Jane, and this is Sarah.
We're at Jane's house, so her saying welcome is especially appropriate.
We're yoga posers. We're yoga posers. And we're going to talk about Uttanasana today, standing forward fold. One of the things about Uttanasana is it's really good for shutting down external disturbances because we come into this forward fold. So we're bringing our awareness and energy inside. And I remember when I was going through my divorce and towards the end of the marriage, like going into a forward fold when conversations got really hard, which was often. I remember one time specifically where John had like pulled out all the finances, and this is when I was finding out that there were credit cards in my name I didn't know about, and I just would drop into a forward fold.
That's amazing.
It was like my body was like, shut down, shut down. And I would go into forward folds, and I remember before meeting with the lawyers, when I was in the separate room, I'd be in a forward fold because I couldn't take any more in.
Wow.
And I just had to... Anyway, they're really useful. Forward folds are really useful for like getting away from whatever external disturbances there are. So yeah.
As an aside, that's exactly what I've been dealing with. My ex-husband and finances and college. And he came to my house.
Did you use a forward fold?
I don't really like Uttanasana all that much, so I don't feel like it's a refuge for me. But I love the idea of just instinctually just taking a random shape, like in response to a situation. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, a warrior could be a nice response.
Right.
But I go to a turtle.
I think if I'm going to randomly take a yoga pose, it's going to be a squat. I just sort of drop into malasana.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. We're talking about standing forward fold. And it seems like such a basic pose to talk about because it's a standing forward fold, but it's one of the poses that I see done incorrectly the most. Although maybe incorrectly is not the right word, but it's done in a way that doesn't serve you and could cause harm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is the running theme of our show. How you're doing yoga poses in a way that might be easy for you, but may cause unintentional harm.
Right.
And I feel like Uttanasana and getting into Uttanasana from standing and then rising back up is the single most valuable diagnostic tool I have to understand someone's overall movement pattern.
Yeah. Yeah. So Uttanasana, right? You can start in Tadasana, usually feet hip distance apart. You want to make sure you're connected to the earth. You're not just passively putting your feet on the ground. So feeling the ball mount and the heel and trying to lift the arches up and engaging the quads and activating the inner leg line. There's a hugging sense to the core. And then typically you inhale, reach your arms up to the sky, and then exhale, hinge at the hips. You don't bend into the forward fold. The pelvis rotates around the head of the femur bones. And that ability is where you're going to first run into obstacles. Mm-hmm. And also, I think the understanding of that's what you're trying to do, because when you say to people fold forward, they'll fold in the place of their body that has the most
capacity to fold.
Yeah. Yeah. Capacity.
Which would often be the waist or the low back.
Yeah. And then when you do that, that's creating more strain on muscles that are not really intended to do that kind of work.
Right. It's just a harmful pattern. Just straight up, that's a harmful pattern. But then like the people who are super hingy at the hip, they need to little bend at the waist would be more helpful for them. So you're going to have the polar...
Oh, you mean the person who can fold and practically
swan
bring
dive.
Their heads between their legs?
Yeah. Yes. Their sit bones turn up to the ceiling and they're like two little devil horns.
Yeah.
As a yoga teacher, you can just see they're like right jacked way up high. And that person is coming in with a lot of lumbar extension.
Yeah.
The opposite of too much lumbar flexion, too much rounding. They're not actually reversing their lumbar curve at all, which I would say in a forward fold, one of the primary intentions is to stretch the back body and to stretch especially the lumbar spine sacral area for those people who are really locked into a lot of hyperlordosis.
Right.
But for the person who folds at the waist and doesn't have a good hip hinge, all they're doing is stretching their back.
Right.
And even though they feel an intense stretch in their hamstrings, they're not hinging at the hip. They're just keeping that tissue way too long. It's already too long. It's already too weak. Now you're stretching it in a forward fold. Their hands don't reach the floor. They're frustrated. It's not helping them. It's not a nice pose, and it doesn't look good.
No, it doesn't look good. No, but that's such a good point.
And again, like, how many times do we have to say it? But it does bear repeating that if you're doing Uttanasana in a way that doesn't serve you, it's not that it's not perfect. It's just that it's not serving you. And it's
right.
You will enjoy the pose much more once you find a better way to do it for you. You just have to find your strategy, which is often different than the one that you're walking in the door with.
Right. And that's so cool because you're just reminding me that when we say forward fold, right, people are doing that, but it's a hinge at the hips.
It's still a forward fold because once you're past 90 degrees with the torso, the spine is rounding. Once the back goes into flexion, and even though the cueing is lengthen the spine and there's value to lengthening the front of the body within the forward fold, it's not supposed to be a flat back beyond 90 degrees. And you're supposed to reverse the lumbar curve. And physical therapists would say you're supposed to reverse that lumbar curve way before you get to 90 degrees. And yoga people have been obsessed with like your vertical, it's flat, flat, flat to 90. And then once you're past 90, you're allowed to start to round. But that's not a standard that is in the physical therapy world,
Really?
which is more attuned to what's actually functional and not just like everything in yoga. Yoga worships like a lot of spinal extension,
Right.
and to excess, and especially in Uttanasana. This is where that swan dive into Uttanasana kind of cueing came from for people that were very rounded. Lengthen the front body, lift up, and then fold with a flat back. But then you see people with lots and lots of arch in their back. It's a forward fold. You're supposed to round the back. The secondary intention is to stretch the legs, the back of the legs, the hamstrings, calves. And the primary intention is to stretch the structures of the back. And that's what induces the relaxation refuge effect that we're talking about, is when the back goes into flexion at a certain point, those muscles turn off and you get a profound relaxation effect. And when the spine is held in extension, you do not get that relaxation effect.
Okay. I can see that, but I haven't really been thinking about the fact that I try to keep the spine long, and I just do it by bending the knees a lot. Like now all my forward folds have lots of bend in the knee, and then I get down and try to get the sit bones higher by extending the sit bones up to the sky as I extend my legs straight.
And that's great if you're a lumbar flexion strategy where you tend to have a tucked pelvis and your back rounds more than you can hinge at the hip, then bending your knees is very effective.
As we know, the hamstrings attach to the two different joints. They attach to the sit bones for the pelvis and then the lower leg. And so if that muscle's already taut by the joints being extended, then there's less room as I try to rotate the pelvis forward.
Right. The hamstrings act as brakes.
Right.
They physically slow you down, right? Just biomechanically.
Right.
Your body is going forward. There needs to be a braking system, which is the hamstrings and the glutes kind of hold you against a collapse, and your back muscles hold you against a collapse as they're eccentrically all contracting as you forward fold. And then we get some lengthening to those structures.
Okay. I'm still stuck on the fact that I'm okay letting my back round a little bit. In my mind I was like, I want to keep the torso really almost neutral, and I'm just taking the pelvis
Impossible.
and tilting it. And that's what you're saying.
Well, the only way to get to that standard, which is a yoga standard, when you see the Uttanasana on the cover of Yoga Journal, the person's that folded in half like this, their halves are touching. Only the longest hamstrings in the world can do that. And I would say that's a very disadvantageous / verging on dangerous / welcome to your hamstring attachment injury for the next 2 years. Have fun healing that. So because
a lot of
that's just people who are super lax in their ligaments can get away with that for a while and then they get the sensation around their sit bones and they stretch that out and then they get the tear.
Okay.
And the more that people try, they just get a lot of strain in those areas because they're trying to get those muscles so incredibly long, thinking like the longer it gets, the better it gets, which is the number one fallacy in yoga. But it looks pretty.
Yeah.
It really does look pretty. I wish I could do it. I can't do it. I can, if I try to do it, I knock out something. I start to feel it in my sit bone. I start to feel it in my sacrum.
So this reminds me of, in my mind's eye, I do a forward fold where I'm in that perfect position, but I'm not hypermobile. I'm not harming any of my joints. I'm not doing anything. It reminds me of I did a dosha quiz and I was like, oh my God, I'm perfect. I'm tridosha, which I'm not. I'm just not at all that. But so I guess if I looked in a mirror, but I'm not going to look in a mirror.
Why not?
Okay. Well, I could, but I have this idea that
you get good
feels
information.
Perfect.
It
feels
should.
perfect. Right.
This is where you're going to think that we're like yoga fascists and like it all has to look right. No, I care more about how it feels when you're going in and how you're using it.
But if it doesn't look like that, then what I would want is I would want to either bring the floor to me through bending my knees or blocks or something. Like, I'm not sure I'm a big fan of the rounding of the back to finish the pose.
Well, you just want sufficient hip hinge. And so you're looking for a couple of things to happen in a forward fold. The first thing that's supposed to happen, according to people who study these kinds of things, is that the pelvis shifts backwards.
Yeah.
So your pelvis kind of rocks back in space to center your weight. Otherwise, your weight is so far ahead of your base of support that it can strain the back. So there's a backwards shift of the pelvis. It shouldn't be like huge.
Yeah, just subtle.
And then the lumbar curve is supposed to reverse. Now, for some people, it's already reversed. So don't worry, you've already checked that box. And if anything, you're trying to extend it. And then the third thing that happens is the hips are supposed to hinge. Now, many people who tend to come into their Uttanasana and their legs are locked straight and they're hinging at the waist and their hands are 2 feet from the floor, they're working on hip hinge right away. Yeah. They're working on extending the spine and actually starting with a neutral spine. They don't need to reverse the spine. They can do a posterior shift, especially those types of people tend to have a long torso and shorter legs.
Right.
And so they need to sway their pelvis back a bit, get some room, get some support, and then really emphasize that hinge. And for them, the longer they can get their torso, the flatter, the straighter, whatever cues you want to use, the better it is. And don't even go to the floor. For those people, I just have them go halfway.
Okay.
They haven't earned the right. Just like in Paschimottanasana, if you're not getting a hip hinge, you don't get to sit there and take the shape of a lump of garbage.
I let people take the shape of a lump of garbage, but I make sure they know that's their choice.
No, I don't.
Okay. So
people are obsessed. They cannot not fold. I see them look. I'm like, put your hands behind you.
Yeah.
Push down into the floor.
Yeah.
Work on getting your spine strong. Your back is already stretched out way too much.
Right. Because they feel there's a goal.
Well, they feel like the shape is the purpose. The shape's not the purpose.
Okay.
The purpose is lengthening the tissue that you need to lengthen. I'm like Khrushchev. Yeah. Banging on the table.
Yeah.
The purpose is to lengthen the tissue that needs to be lengthened and shorten the tissue that's way too long.
Okay. So I'm going to bring us back to the hip hinge because I want to be really specific on it. And we have the pelvis, and the pelvis has acetabulums. It has joints, the cover of the joint in the pelvis. And then the thigh bone has the head of the femur, which is the ball in the socket in the joint. The ball in the socket is the hip joint. The rest that we refer to as hip is probably, I think it's incorrect, right? It's like you got glutes, you got all this stuff, right? It's a pelvis.
I had a client today. I'm like, put your hands on the top of your pelvis. She goes, that's not my pelvis. Those are my hips. I'm like, those are not your hips.
Right.
So then we have a real learning moment. It is that confusion because we all use pelvis, hips interchangeably, and it's a habit I cannot break.
Yeah. So I want to just be clear that in this pose, what we're trying to do is we're trying to rotate the pelvis forward, and it is rolling around the head of the femur bone. That's where the hinge in the pelvis happens, right? So we get an anterior forward movement of the pelvis as it rolls around the head of the femur bones, and it can get tripped up in doing that because the muscles that hold that pelvis upright are too restrictive, they're not allowing it, or a bunch of other things can get in the way.
It's primarily the hamstrings are just pulling the back of the pelvis down so much, they have to release, they have to let go. People with short hamstrings stand with their pelvis shoved forward and gripping in those upper hamstrings. Those muscles are really, really tight, and they never sit on their sit bones, those people. They sit in hip extension. And so for them to achieve hip flexion is like going to the moon. It's extremely difficult to get people to hinge at the hip who do not know how and never do it.
Right.
And everything in their musculature is saying no, because there's no way they can afford to let these hamstrings lengthen because of the postures that these people habitually take.
Right. And I was thinking when we come back to getting the pelvic tilts by using our feet on the floor, and that's a really good place for people to start understanding that it's this movement of the pelvis that I'm looking for. It's a cueing that I keep incorporating, I keep coming back to, right? So if I'm on the back, it's just finding the movement of the pelvis around the head of the femur bones, right? When you're pressing your feet down and you pull them in, that's going to give you a forward or anterior tilt in the pelvis. And it's that tilt that you would continue to move forward until theoretically it is perpendicular to the floor, right?
The degrees of hip flexion, 90 degrees of hip flexion, a little bit more than that. Here's the thing. I really dove deep into pelvic tilt, and using that terminology is how yoga teachers, you and I, use it. And then we had this big argument about pelvic tilt during Cobra. And I was saying like, no, the pelvis can't be neutral. And you're like, the pelvis is neutral every pose. I was like, where is this coming from? So then I looked it up, and there's this whole thing. And I'm telling you, no one can agree on this because it's the semantics. I only got 4 hours of sleep doing this on 4 hours of sleep, people. Semantics. Pelvic tilt originated, here's my understanding, and please help me find more information on this, people out there. Pelvic tilt is used to describe when the pelvis is not neutral.
Yeah.
Hard stop. Anterior pelvic tilt is a fault. Too much anterior tilt. It's really the only way that people talked about pelvic tilt for a while. Was
anterior?
Too much anterior pelvic tilt. This was always the problem. And that's why we lengthen through the tailbone. And now a lot of people now are, posterior. A lot of the teaching is like, okay, everyone's in too much of a posterior tilt. So now posterior tilt's a problem. Okay. Things come really casually into the yoga world because there's not a lot of training and not a lot of strict standards about how we learn. And so there's a lot of casual talk. And so what's happening when the pelvis rotates over the head of the femur, it's not a tilt. It's hip flexion. It's not anterior pelvic tilt.
Right. So
but we can think about it that way because that's what kind of makes sense. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the pelvis tilt forward relative to gravity.
Right.
But what's happening is the hips are flexing. It's happening at the hip joint, which is the crux of this being not a tilt issue, although you can modify tilt as you hinge at the hip. You can modify. But what's happening is, and this is why hip hinge is so important, is to clarify all of this as something separate and distinct from pelvic tilt. And to get people to know what the hip crease is. It's the crease in your pants. When you lift your knee up and there's a crease in your pants, that's where you're hinging. That's your hip joint. Amazing. Most people don't know that. And then we hinge there. It's the crease is deepening. You're folding at the hip crease.
Okay, well, so then if the pelvic tilt is not bringing us, if the pelvis stays neutral and it just either moves forward on the head of the femur bone or back on the head of the femur bone, then the idea of a forward or backward tilt is looking at the wrong structure. Is that what you're saying?
I'm just saying it's a fine-tuning thing. It's not like, biomechanically we're looking for a forward tilt. I think you were right and I was wrong in Cobra. And I was like, should I cut all this out to save face? I didn't. I kept it in. And I was like, I think I talked myself out of this. I was like a cat in a bag.
Yeah. But that's so fascinating, right?
When someone hinges at the hip, they could hinge too readily. And we could say that's too much anterior tilt. And so they need to slow that down.
Right.
With more abdominal work, more glute contraction, building up stronger hamstrings and shorter hamstrings over time. And then the person who can't hinge at the hip, we could think of that as like too much posterior tilt. They haven't achieved a hip hinge, but really they just haven't hinged at the hip. And so they need to abduct their legs and they need to lift their heels, bend their knees, and manually lift the back of the pelvis up so that hinge
create
starts
more space
to happen.
in the back line.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's cool. And it reminds me of so many other lessons that we learn in life. It's like the frame, the perspective. What are we looking at when we're having this conversation?
And by talking about it,
Yeah.
because I was like, if someone had ever said to me, Sarah, you're not actually clear on pelvic tilt, I'd be like, my whole life is pelvic tilt, literally every day. I'm married to pelvic tilt. How can you not tell? I know pelvic tilt.
Yeah.
That's the danger, beginner's mind.